listening to an episode of Studio Forum of Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm Martin Kohlrausch. I'm a professor of modern European political history here at KU Leuven, and with me is Małgorzata Jędrzejczyk. Małgorzata is an art historian, curator, and academic teacher at the Academy of Fine Arts in Katowice, Poland. She studied in Krakow, Vienna, and Berlin, and since 2018, she's been a curator of the program Exercising Modernity of the Pilecki Institute in Berlin. She's an author and editor of numerous publications on 20th and 21st century art and architecture, including in particular publications on Katarzyna Kobro. And she curated different exhibitions, among others, at the National Museum in Krakow recently. Many thanks, Małgorzata, for being here in Leuven, sharing your ideas with us. I'd like to start with the question of moved maps, avant-gardes beyond West and East. In how far have maps been moved? Do maps need to be moved, should be moved? What is behind this idea of moved maps?
Hello, and first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to present our research topic here at the KU Leuven. Yes, the question of moved maps. Actually, important impulse for me to think about this issue was a publication by Przemysław Czapliński, published issue some years ago. It was a book with a title, A Moved Map, and its reference or main topic was a question: how do Poles think about Poland on a map of Europe? How they imagine their position within Europe? How then they describe their geographical position, but also cultural position within Europe? And this is a question actually where we can, or how we can understand geopolitical divisions in reference to some cultural or imagined borders, how we can actually see this relationship between them. Do they overlap, or we can see some clashes, some discontinuities between those two kinds of maps? Thinking about moving map or moved map in reference to culture, or in a narrow sense maybe in reference to art or avant-garde discourse or research, it is a question, of course, of what happened in the beginning of 20th century with particularly this part of Europe. Immense shifts and immense changes of political borders, migration of people, migration of objects, migration of ideas, and mutual exchange as well between different avant-garde groups, different avant-garde artists, not only from Central Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe, but also between this part of the world and other parts of the world. So the question which is, I think, important to be posed in the context of the research on the avant-garde is to what borders does this label of East or West refer to, and what consequences of thinking about art history, thinking about the history of avant-garde has this kind of labeling. What are the consequences for analyzing and for describing? And what are the consequences also for today's understanding of this kind of like artist movements or artist initiatives when we try to implement this kind of categorization and try to organize our knowledge like using those kind of labels like East-West.
Many thanks. I believe that also in the last 20, 30 years, after the end of the Cold War, there has been a lot of research into avant-gardes in so-called Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and these avant-gardes have, from a Western perspective, been discovered, rediscovered, and there's often a tendency of that they should also have their place on the map of the avant-garde, so like they're added to the picture which is already there. At the same time, my impression is that already then, and that in a certain way is still present today, there are still strong hierarchies and asymmetries. So if you look back to the 1920s, I think it's very clear that the avant-gardes in Poland, in Belarus, in the Soviet Union more broadly, have been extremely dynamic, more so probably than in many Western countries. At the same time, there was a lack of political stability. You wouldn't have economic resources to publish and so forth, and all these political stability, financial resources, economic resources were of course much stronger in the West, so it was still very much Western centers which decided on who could forward their careers and so forth. Or do you think, is it like a map where simply certain regions should be added, or do we also need to think about these hierarchies and asymmetries, and how far do they still exist today?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's an important question, and I think there is no one single answer on this, because I'm convinced there are many levels of thinking about this issue, and one is more like historical one. Let's go back to the avant-garde as a kind of transnational movement, and also let us go back also to ideas and to attempts of the avant-garde or avant-garde artists to go beyond the borders, to be constantly in touch, to exchange letters, to exchange images like reproductions of the work, to publish texts in countries abroad. So it was a kind of struggle to be beyond national borders. And let us also remember that beginning of 20th century, after collapse of great empires, Austro-Hungary Empire, Russian Empire, we encounter a birth of national states. Like Poland is again on the map. We have Lithuania. We have different countries. Czechoslovakia we have, and avant-garde was trying to overcome these national borders and to think about art not in national terms, not to think about art as something which is national, which can be labeled as national, but something which can be seen more as a kind of universal project that goes beyond the borders. So this is one thing, and art magazines, for example, are a very good example of this try and example of this kind of attitude, presenting images showing contemporary achievements of the colleagues abroad, publishing their texts, sending letters, asking for texts, asking for images. It's constantly there, so it's part of this avant-garde movement, and thinking also using different media and new media as important art tools, not something which is secondary to art, but something which has equal importance in terms of creating or sharing this attitude and this kind of thinking about art. So this is one thing. And of course, this other dimension was the limitation that the artists encountered in particular countries. And of course, there were great centers of art where, like Paris or Berlin, where you had totally different possibilities and totally different also infrastructure for creating art, for exhibiting art, for sharing art. And of course, it was important for, let's say, Polish artists, avant-garde Polish artists, to be also part of this world. But what was interesting, I think, in the Polish context was that even with very limited resources and with very complicated political, economical, social situation in Poland, because after 1918, when Poland popped up again on the geopolitical map of Europe, of course it was a country that for more than 100 years was divided into 3 empires. And in Poland you had different transportation systems, different monetary systems, different law systems, different languages as well. And this very multi-cultural country as well, but also a very not unified country, had to struggle with different limitations and different problems, also economical ones, etc. But within this context, a very strong avant-garde movement appeared. And it was also a movement that criticized art which was more like closer to the state position, closer to kind of national myth, closer to this kind of using and misusing art as something which is simply propaganda or something which is simply understood as a political tool. Avant-garde artists were convinced about the special role of the art. So not only that we have this aesthetical level and that's it. No, the art had also be responsible or was conceived as acting responsible regard towards society, and had also some tasks within society. But these were not the tasks, for example, Katarzyna Kobra, Władysław Strzemiński, who were leading figures of avant-garde in Poland back then. Very interesting biographies. Katarzyna Kobro was educated in Moscow. She had German, Russian roots. She married Władysław Strzemiński, who was born in Minsk, to partially Polish family. Beginning of 20s, they decided to leave Russia and to move to Poland to establish their avant-garde movement, to organize this kind of avant-garde group, and to build totally different context for creating art which will be like concentrating on its own development, its own changes, but at the same time art which was seen as an important agent of societal changes, art which can completely redesign the way how we think about our everyday life experience. Of course, not directly, and this is, I think, a crucial thing which should be stressed, that there was no direct link between like artist and, let's say, a work in a factory. That was the idea that was very prominent, for example, within productivist group, Rodchenko, and this part of the avant-garde in Russia. But in Poland, in case of Strzemiński and Kobro, maybe mostly Kobro, art was seen as something which can redefine the very basic principles, how we think about the world and how we also design the world, how we design the space of everyday experience. And the micro level, let's say, of this process was art, like sculpture, painting. And only in the next step, this kind of basic solutions, basic ideas, and very like basic principles can be developed further and can be like applied. But it's the step further, and it's not the task of artists to be applied artists, let's say.
Many thanks. I very much understand your point of also stressing like the inherently critical potential which is in the whole project of avant-garde, and then, for example, particularly to be found in the work of Katarzyna Kobro, about whom you've worked and written. But you also pointed to the specific situation after 1918 with the old new states or refounded states like Poland emerging again on the map of Europe. And we also see that, of course, the interests of the politicians, the administrations, and the avant-garde artists are not congruent, but to a certain degree they are. In certain areas, the politics are very happy to also embrace more what they would perceive as modern strands in art and architecture. And it's my impression that in the last 20 years or so in Poland, today's Poland, this has been repeated to a certain degree. There is also a very positive view of the avant-garde. There have been many exhibitions in Warsaw, more recently in Krakow, different angles, but generally speaking, what I see is a very positive idea of the avant-garde, with the idea of stressing the modernity of the Polish state, Polish society, Polish art scene in a European comparison. would you say that some of these tendencies in the 20s, when the state also actively embraced modernism, modernity, in order to create a certain image for itself, for this contested state, is it there also today? Is it like something similar we see, that also the official politics try to use broadly understood idea of modernism, modernity, and then more specifically the avant-gardes?
Yes, so there is certain interests in avant-garde, but I would say from the political point of view, this interest, which was very visible like a few years ago when in Poland we celebrated a kind of anniversary, 100 years of like avant-garde, of beginning of avant-garde movements in Poland. So like just like Germany celebrated Bauhaus, and you had Bauhaus like everywhere. You had Bauhaus in exhibitions, you had Bauhaus in books, you had Bauhaus in shops, you had Bauhaus on the fridge, you had Bauhaus like on the streets, everywhere, and everything was Bauhaus. In Poland, we witnessed very, maybe not similar, but also this kind of intense interest in like reviving avant-garde. But I would say it is still very, it's an interest which is mostly limited to a kind of fancy and good-looking aesthetics. Not necessarily going deeper and going into the roots of the avant-garde, not necessarily rethinking also the relationship between avant-garde and the state. Of course, there were also projects made by different institutions, for example, curators, artists, who were trying like to make this kind of revision, contemporary revision of the avant-garde, Polish avant-garde, or avant-garde in Poland at the beginning of 20th century. But from the political point of view, my impression was that it was not really understood what avant-garde meant back then, and what was also this kind of very not easy to describe relationship between state politics and avant-garde and artists in Poland in 20s and 30s. But what was embraced very much by the politicians a few years ago during the celebrations, it was the fact that avant-garde was also tightly linked to an idea of modernization processes that happened in Poland or were associated with the Second Polish Republic, so with the government of Second Polish Republic. And this kind of link was very much stressed as something which was like crucial, which showed the very progressive attitude of Polish government back then, and this moment of like rebirth of Poland with the country that started to be present again on the map of Europe, that started to be great again.
Yeah, that was very plausible to me. Also, the example of the Bauhaus you referred to, which I think is very much also a case in point of how certain historical phenomenon, heritage, is instrumentalized or looked at from a very specific angle, and how this also stands in the way of a deeper, better, more historically, more complex, more nuanced understanding of the phenomenon of the avant-garde. And it's particularly for this reason that I'm so grateful that you could come to Leuven, presenting us a much more complex, richer understanding of the avant-gardes and why it is so important to look at the region of East Central Europe. I'd like to thank you again and wish you all the best for the many future projects you have in mind.
Thank you very much, Martin.